What is the price of breaking an oath protected for centuries? In the heart of Paris, a guardsman provided the answer in 30 seconds, over the bodies of 4 fake policemen. Who was this guardsman? Why did he remain silent like a frozen statue against hours of insults and physical attacks? What was the final act that forced him to unleash such a sudden and ruthless reaction? Moreover, were the men before him truly officers of the law, or was this merely the visible surface of a much deeper plot? The incident took place in the famous Place des Invalides, before the eyes of hundreds of tourists, children, and cameras. The battle-hardened soldier, Marc Delacroix, true to the orders he had received, met every blow like a stone. But the leader of the aggressors made a fatal mistake. He let fall the last drop that overflowed the cup of patience. This act transformed years of training and a will of steel into a deadly weapon in mere seconds. To uncover the story behind Marc Delacroix's 30-second fury, his incredible tale, and how the power of silence triumphed, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Because true strength is not always the one that shouts, but the one that acts at the right moment. In the heart of Paris, where history breathes between stone walls, the Place des Invalides stands as a place where time itself seems to slow down. Every stone here is etched with the footsteps of the soldiers who guard the tranquility of Napoleon's tomb. On that day, as the golden rays of the sun danced upon the marble statues, the air was filled with a sense of honor and duty. The whispers of tourists, the distant hum of the city, and the incessant clicks of cameras made up the daily rhythm of this sacred space. But at the center of this rhythm, aloof from everything, stood one man, motionless as a rock in his own world, soldier Marc Delacroix. The uniform he wore was not just a piece of cloth, it was an armor representing a nation's history, sacrifice, and unwavering discipline. For this man, who had served in 3 different combat zones, feeling the cold breath of death on his neck at every moment, this guard duty was not just a job, but an oath to the spirits of the past and the hopes of the future. His eyes were fixed forward, his chin was up, and his body was as still as a statue forged from steel. He felt neither the hot sun nor the curious gazes circling him. In his mind, there was only one thing: duty. This was his fortress, his sanctuary. But every fortress has its moment of trial, and that moment was approaching in a way no one expected. Before we begin our video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support gives us the strength to investigate stories like this and bring them to you. At that moment, a shadowy group of 4 men appeared, shattering the majestic silence of the place. The fake police uniforms they wore sat on them not with the weight of true authority, but like props from a cheap theatrical play. There was no trace of the disciplined steps of a soldier or a policeman in their gait. Instead, their movements were filled with a self-satisfied arrogance, a shamelessness that challenged everything around them. Their smiles were not genuine but filled with a derisive sneer that mocked all before them. They had not come here to maintain order or to fulfill a duty. Their purpose was different, darker, baser. They were looking for a victim to satisfy their egos, and their eyes were fixed on the motionless, seemingly defenseless Marc Delacroix. Weaving through the crowd, they came directly in front of the soldier. The man who was clearly their leader, short and muscular, placed his hands on his hips and began to survey the soldier. His mocking voice was loud enough to spread across the entire square. "Look, boys, we have a toy soldier here. How much do they pay you to stand here like a stone all day? Or is this the only job that incompetents like you can do?" These words were like a poisoned arrow hanging in the air. Some of the surrounding tourists looked at them with unease, while others, intrigued, took out their phones and began to record the moment. But Marc gave no reaction. The expression on his face did not change, his eyes did not blink for a moment. He did not hear these words, because the fortress in his mind was too strong to allow such cheap provocations to penetrate. He knew that his honor lay not in the words of these street jesters, but in the uniform he wore and the values he had sworn to uphold. However, for the provocateurs, this silence was a sign of cowardice. They took Marc's silence as a confirmation of their own arrogance and dared to go further. The leader stepped closer to the soldier, standing so close that his breath could be felt on Marc's face. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue? Or did your commander forbid you from talking too?" he shouted. Then, in a move no one expected, he reached out his finger and touched the shiny button on Marc's chest, pushing him. This was not just a touch. It was an insult. It was an attack on a soldier's honor, a nation's history, and a man's dignity in front of hundreds of tourists. A gasp rose from the crowd. Some people shook their heads and began to walk away, but the majority held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Marc's body did not move a single millimeter from that light push. He was still a rock. But inside, deep down, something had begun to stir. It was not anger. It was that cold, analytical feeling he had felt hundreds of times on the battlefields, on that thin line between life and death. The instinct to assess the threat, calculate the enemy's next move, and act at the most opportune moment. The leader and his companions, however, were further emboldened by this silence. They thought the man before them was merely a ceremonial puppet. They did not know that his endurance had a limit, and that limit was about to be broken. The thin line between provocation and physical assault had now been crossed, and things were about to get much worse. They did not know that this silence was not a sign of weakness, but the harbinger of a deadly storm, forged over years on the battlefield, waiting for the right moment to explode. Before everyone's eyes, with history as a witness, a man's cup of patience was about to overflow. The tense silence that followed after the leader's finger withdrew from Marc Delacroix's chest was reminiscent of the deadly calm before a storm. The provocateur was both surprised and angered by the soldier's steel-like lack of reaction. His plan was simple: to break this toy soldier, to humiliate everything he represented, and to present himself as a hero in the eyes of the surrounding crowd. But the man before him was not the weak puppet of his imagination. Marc's silence was not an expression of the fear or submission he expected, but of an incomprehensible strength. This strength struck the leader's ego like a slap. The other members of the group began to laugh in a vile manner at their leader's failed attempt, which further fueled his anger. He could not back down. He could not appear defeated in front of the crowd and the cameras. For this reason, he decided to go even further. This time, words would not suffice. This time, he had to get a response with pain and violence. Lunging forward again, this time he openly slapped Marc across the face. In that moment, time seemed to freeze. The sound of the slap cracked like a whip in the grand silence of the Place des Invalides, taking the breath away from everyone around. For a moment, all sounds ceased, the whispers of the tourists, the hum of the city, even the chirping of the birds were cut short. Everyone's eyes were on the face of the motionless soldier, who had been subjected to this ugliest form of insult. Marc's head tilted slightly to the side from the impact of the blow, but his feet were as firm as if nailed to the ground. He didn't even blink. In his mind, however, a different world was coming to life. This was not a physical pain. Compared to the feeling he had experienced on the sandy hills of Afghanistan, as enemy bullets whizzed past his head, this was as insignificant as a mosquito bite. His brain was working like a computer programmed with years of training and combat experience. It was analyzing the angle of the blow, the aggressor's position, the location of the other three men, and the potential threat level in a thousandth of a second. On one side of his brain, his commander's order was repeating, "No matter what happens, do not move. You're a symbol. Your reaction is the army's reaction." On the other side, his warrior's instinct was screaming, "Neutralize the threat. Defend yourself. Survive." These two forces clashed in the depths of his soul, but for now, the sense of duty prevailed. He was not just a soldier, he was a sentry at the Place des Invalides, and his protocol was paramount. What do you think? When a person's honor and dignity are trampled upon like this in front of hundreds of people, should there be a limit to patience? At what point does breaking the silence become a justified action? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. The aggressors, however, did not understand Marc's superhuman endurance. For them, this just meant more fun. After the leader's slap, the others were also emboldened. It was no longer an attack by a single man, but had turned into a lynch mob attempt where a cowardly pack had gathered around their victim. One lunged forward and grabbed the collar of Marc's uniform, trying to shake him. Another reached out his hand to pull the famous bearskin hat from his head. This act was one of the greatest insults. That hat was not just a piece of headwear, but a symbol of a centuries-old tradition, of the sacrifice of thousands of soldiers. Their tugging at it was an act of disrespect to a nation's heritage. The third aggressor approached from behind and began kicking Marc's legs, trying to unbalance him. The Place des Invalides was no longer a place of honor, but an arena where a group of street thugs displayed their savage instincts. Their laughter mixed with the uneasy whispers and angry stares of the people around them. Some voices began to rise from the crowd, "Stop. Get out of here, call the police." But these voices were just background music in the ears of the aggressors. They drew strength from the crowd's fear and non-intervention. A mother, picking up her crying little boy, turned his face away to protect his eyes from this ugly scene. This scene was the most vivid proof of how out of control the situation had become. Despite all these physical attacks, Marc still maintained his position. But the balance in his inner world was about to be shattered. Every blow that landed on his body was a step that brought him closer to that red line in his mind. He was still obeying his commander's order, but at the same time, he remembered the most fundamental rule of a warrior: protect your life. These men were no longer just provocateurs. They had become a threat, acting with uncontrolled rage, and it was unclear what their next move would be. The leader, seeing that Mark was still not broken, screamed like a wild animal that had lost its mind. All his attempts had failed. This motionless figure before him had raised all his arrogance to the ground. For him, this was no longer a game. It had become a personal matter. His eyes red with anger, he gathered all his strength and clenched his fist to deliver the final and most deadly blow. This would not be just a slap or a push. This was a punch aimed at Mark's jaw or temple, intended to knock him to the ground, perhaps to injure him seriously. As he drew his fist back, one could feel all the molecules in the air freeze. This was the final point. This was the final moment where a soldier's patience, a man's dignity, and a warrior's survival instinct were put to the test. And in that moment, Mark Delacroix knew that the time for silence was over. The storm was about to break. The moment the leader's furiously clenched fist arced through the air, moving towards Mark Delacroix's head in a deadly trajectory, the flow of time seemed to thicken and slow down. Everyone in the crowd had become a part of that moment. Some shut their eyes in horror, while others held their breath, awaiting the outcome of this seemingly inevitable violence. A smug smile shone on the aggressor's face, relishing the moment his victim would finally break. He was unaware that within the motionless figure before him, a beast that had been dormant for years was awakening. That fist was descending not just upon a mass of flesh and bone, but towards the final frontier of a soldier's endurance. And the moment that frontier was crossed, all the rules changed. The stones of the Place des Invalides had witnessed many battles over the centuries, but on that day, in the heart of the modern world, they were about to witness one of the quietest and fastest battles ever. In that moment, for Mark Delacroix, there were no more protocols, no more orders. Only one thing remained, the instinct for survival and the unshakable training of a warrior. Centimeters before the fist could connect with Mark's face, that statue-like body exploded. It wasn't an angry explosion. It was a silent, precise, and lethally effective movement. That body, which had stood motionless for years, unleashed like a compressed spring. Mark's left hand shot up with unforeseen speed, blocking the incoming fist from the inside. It wasn't a strike, but a redirection. He used the aggressor's own force and kinetic energy against him, twisting his arm to the side. The leader, thrown off balance by the force of his own punch, stumbled forward. The victorious expression in his eyes was instantly replaced by shock and confusion. But Mark didn't give him a single moment to recover. Without releasing the arm he had blocked, he used his body weight to apply precise pressure to the leader's elbow joint. The leader screamed in pain and collapsed to his knees. Simultaneously, Mark's right leg moved with lightning speed, hooking behind his supporting leg and sweeping him off the ground. The leader crumpled to the ground like a sack. All of this had happened in less than 2 seconds. The other members of the gang froze for a moment when they saw their leader unexpectedly floored. Their brains were trying to process the scene they were witnessing. This was not part of their plan. Their toy soldier had fought back, but it wasn't a cowardly defense, it was the professional counterattack of a master. This brief hesitation was their undoing. Mark, without giving a second glance to the fallen leader, pivoted clockwise. The second aggressor was still clutching the collar of Mark's uniform. Mark grabbed his arm with both hands, pressing his fingers into the nerve points on his wrist. The aggressor screamed in unbearable pain and let go of the collar. Mark pulled him forward and lightly kneed him in the stomach. This was not a move to knock him out, but a calculated action to simply wind him and break his resistance. The second man collapsed, coughing and gasping for breath. The third and fourth aggressors finally snapped out of their shock and tried to attack simultaneously. This was the biggest mistake an inexperienced fighter could make. Instead of getting between them, Mark took a step back, allowing them to obstruct each other. As the third aggressor lunged forward, Mark grabbed him by the shoulder, spun him around, and threw him directly into the fourth aggressor. The two bodies collided and tumbled to the ground in an awkward heap. 30 seconds. That's all it took. 30 seconds ago, 4 arrogant men were challenging a statue. Now, 4 helpless bodies were writhing on the ground, groaning in pain and shock. And at the center of it all stood Mark Delacroix. There was no anger, no triumph, no excitement on his face. The same stone-like, emotionless, and calm expression. His breathing was not even disturbed. He didn't even look at the men on the ground. It was as if they had never existed. He calmly took a step, picked up the bearskin hat that had fallen from his head during the attack. He brushed off the invisible dust with his hand. Then, with the same ceremonial gravity, he placed the hat back on his head, straightened the collar of his uniform, and with a single step, returned to his guard post. He straightened his body, lifted his chin, and once again fixed his eyes on the horizon. It was as if nothing had happened in the last minute. As if he wasn't the one who had just neutralized 4 men with the cold professionalism of a master warrior. He had once again become a part of the place des Invalides, a silent guardian of history. A deadly silence reigned over the square. Hundreds of tourists stood with their mouths agape, their hands trembling, still holding their recording phones, staring at the scene. The image of the toy soldier in their minds had been shattered, replaced by a feeling of deep respect and awe mixed with fear. They had witnessed firsthand the difference between loud arrogance and silent strength. From a distance, the faint sound of approaching police sirens could be heard, cutting through the city's noise. The story was not over yet. The sound of distant sirens grew clearer, echoing off the stone walls of the Place des Invalides and heightening the tension. The crowd, like a silent sea, slowly parted to make way for the approaching police cars. A few minutes later, 2 police cars and an ambulance brigade swiftly entered the edge of the square. The officers who got out of the cars, with professional agility, immediately tried to bring the situation under control. Their movements carried the confidence and seriousness of true authority. It was the complete opposite of the fake and arrogant posture of the 4 men now writhing on the ground. An experienced commissioner took command and surveyed the scene. The sight before him was a tableau he had rarely encountered even in his 20-year career. 4 disheveled men groaning on the ground, hundreds of shocked tourists around them, and at the center of all this chaos, a military guard standing motionless as a statue, as if living in another reality. The commissioner's first action was to order some officers to attend to the men on the ground, while others began to question the witnesses. In that moment, it was as if a dam had broken. Dozens of people tried to explain to the police what had happened, all at once. Although they spoke in different languages, English, French, Spanish, all the stories converged on the same point. They started it, they attacked the soldier, they insulted him, they hit him. Most importantly, dozens of phones had recorded every moment of the incident. Witnesses eagerly showed the police the videos they had taken. The footage revealed everything with crystal clarity: the arrogant provocations of the 4 men, the verbal insults, the first physical contact, the successive blows, and finally, the leader's attempted fatal punch. And throughout all this, the soldier's superhuman patience and his swift, yet controlled actions taken only at the last moment to defend himself. The evidence was undeniable. The police approached the 4 men on the ground. The shameless smiles had completely vanished from their faces. Now, their expressions were filled with fear, regret, and a pathetic plea. Their leader, groaning from the pain in his arm, tried to portray themselves as victims. "We didn't do anything. He attacked us. We were just joking." But the commissioner responded to this pathetic lie with a cold gaze. "A joke? Are these fake uniforms on you part of the joke? Impersonating a public official, attacking a soldier on duty? Your sense of humor is quite interesting, gentlemen." These words shattered their last hopes. They understood what the consequences would be. The commissioner left the pitiful scene behind and walked towards the silent hero of the entire incident. He slowed his steps as he approached Marc Delacroix. It was a sign of respect. He knew the protocol of a military guard, his inviolability while on duty. He stopped a few steps from Marc and asked with formal politeness, but with respect in his voice, "Soldier, are you all right? Do you have any injuries?" Marc, without taking his eyes off the horizon, gave a slight but sharp shake of his head, signaling no. That was his entire report. Nothing more was needed. The commissioner understood. He did not insist. By this time, a military police officer had also arrived at the scene. He was Marc's commander. The officer had a brief conversation with the commissioner, stated that the necessary procedures would be initiated, and then stood by his soldier. He asked him no questions. He simply stood beside him, showing with his silent presence that everything was under control. It was a perfect example of the mutual respect and discipline between 2 different branches of power, civil and military. A few minutes later, each of the 4 aggressors was handcuffed. As they were lifted to their feet and led towards the police cars, they hung their heads in shame. The hundreds of eyes that now looked at them were filled not with the curiosity or amusement of a few minutes ago, but with a deep contempt and disgust. Their own arrogance and stupidity, their desire for a few minutes of fame, had led them down the path to prison. Their humiliating removal marked the closing of the first act of this story. Arrogance had received its just punishment. The police cars left the square silently, without turning on their sirens. The ambulance, after examining the aggressors' minor injuries, followed them. The tension in the square slowly dissipated, but the change in the atmosphere was still palpable. The Place des Invalides was no longer just a historical site. It had become the stage where a modern legend was born. Although people began to disperse, many still stood in place, looking at the silent guard with awe and respect. The videos on their phones would soon spread throughout the world and write the name of Mark Delacroix in the pages of history as a symbol of silent strength and unwavering discipline. And he was still there, oblivious to it all, at his post, continuing to stand, faithful to his oath. Although the clouds of tension over the Place des Invalides lifted with the departure of the police cars, the air left behind was different. This was no longer just a place of stone and history. It had become the stage where living legend was born. Tourists, instead of engaging in cheerful conversations and taking pictures as before, spoke in whispers, gazing at the lone figure still standing motionless at his post with looks of respect and awe. In their eyes, he was no longer a man in an ornate uniform. He was a living monument to indomitable will, steel-like discipline, and silent dignity. Everyone knew that what they had witnessed today would be the first story they would tell about Paris when they returned home. This was a more unforgettable memory than the lights of the Eiffel Tower or the art of the Louvre. This was the story of the absolute victory of the human spirit's strength over physical violence and arrogance. And this story was not just spreading by word of mouth. It was spreading like wildfire in the digital world at the speed of light. At that very moment, on screens all over the world, videos shot from dozens of different angles began to appear. Hashtags like #SilentSoldier, #Hero of Invalides, #TrueStrength started trending on social media platforms. The footage was being watched, shared, and commented on by millions of people. Everyone was discussing the soldiers' superhuman endurance, the vile actions of the aggressors, and finally, that swift, silent, and professional intervention. Some were amazed by the cold precision of his movements, while others could not believe the patience he had shown until he reached that point. Mark Delacroix, without being aware of it himself, had suddenly become the center of the world's attention. His story reminded people of values that seemed forgotten in the noisy and chaotic flow of the modern world: honor, duty, dignity, discipline. So, what do you think? In our modern world where rapid consumption and individual egos are at the forefront, is there still a need for the kind of unwavering discipline and sense of honor that Mark Delacroix represents? Or are these values just relics of the past that should remain in museums and history books? Sharing your thoughts on this deep topic in the comments is very valuable for us to understand the philosophy of this story. A few hours later, in a quiet room at the military base, Mark's commander, Colonel Dubois, was watching the same videos over and over again on the screen in front of him. He wasn't just seeing a soldier defending himself. He was seeing the perfect embodiment of everything he had tried to instill in his soldiers for years. He saw how a man could set aside his ego, his instincts, and his anger, and remain faithful only to his duty and his oath. The colonel knew that it took courage to open fire on the enemy on the battlefield, but to stand motionless in front of an unarmed crowd, while being subjected to insults and attacks, required more than courage. It required a will of steel, an unbreakable character, and an absolute belief in the values his existence represented. He was proud of his soldier. But at the same time, he felt a deep sorrow that he had been forced to go through such a vile ordeal. This incident was a bitter proof of how little society understood the sacrifice and endurance of the man behind the uniform. Ultimately, this was the true lesson of this incident. True strength was not in the hardness of fists or the loudness of a voice. True strength was in being able to remain silent when you had every right to shout. True strength was in silently meeting the stones thrown at you like the walls of a fortress, but when the fortress itself was threatened, to eliminate that threat with a well-thought-out and precise strategy. The aggressors thought they were strong because they made noise, threatened, and used violence. But theirs was a false power, like the rattle of an empty box. Mark Delacroix, on the other hand, was silent, because his power was as calm as a deep river, but just as resilient and potentially destructive. The people at the Place des Invalides that day witnessed not just a fight, but a clash of two different concepts of power, the power of showmanship and the power of character. And in the end, character won an absolute victory. The day began to set, and Mark's shift was coming to an end. In a few minutes, he would hand over his post to another soldier, take off that honorable uniform, and become one of the millions of people walking the streets of Paris, leaving behind a legend he had created in just a few hours. But what did he think about all that had happened? What did the man under that statue, inside that uniform, feel? The final act of the story sought the answer to this very question. The sun slowly descended on the Paris horizon, painting the stones of the Place des Invalides in a warm orange hue. The time for Mark Delacroix's shift to end had arrived. The other guard who was to replace him approached with the same unshakable steps and the same serious expression. The two soldiers, in a silent dance of a centuries-old tradition, changed positions. Their movements were so precise, so synchronized, that they seemed like two bodies controlled by a single will. This brief but meaningful ceremony was a symbol not of an individual, but of the continuity of a system, a set of values. Mark Delacroix would leave, but the silent guard standing in his place would remain forever. After handing over his post, Mark, without looking back, proceeded with the same measured steps towards the interior of the military base. The crowd watched his departure with silent respect. They were witnessing the exit of a legend from the stage. He, however, longed to get away from all this attention, whispers, and admiring gazes. For him, the most beautiful moment of the day was the moment he could take off the heavy burden of responsibility and become just Mark again. The silence of the locker room was like a balm after the tension of the day. He began to take off his uniform, slowly, methodically. Each piece was a symbol. The heavy bearskin hat, the shiny buttons, the medals of honor. All of this was an armor that covered his individual identity and turned him into an ideal. As the armor came off, a man emerged from beneath it, carrying the fatigue of the day, yet still standing proud. Finally, when he was left in a simple t-shirt and jeans, he looked at his reflection in the mirror. What he saw was not the superhuman hero from the viral videos. What he saw was just a man. And what did that man feel? Pride? No. In his soul, there was more of a deep melancholy than pride. He did not regret what he had done, because he had no other choice. But he regretted that the situation had come to that point. His duty was to protect peace and order. Violence, even when justified, meant the disruption of that order. For him, victory was not knocking those four men to the ground. For him, the real victory was conquering his own ego and instincts during those long minutes before the punch landed on his face. In his mind, moments from the dusty, blood-scented lands of Afghanistan came to life. He remembered what real battles, what real danger was. Compared to those moments, what happened today was as bitter and meaningless as a child's squabble. Those four men did not even have the strength to physically harm him. Their only weapons were their arrogance and their shamelessness. And Mark knew that these weapons could hurt more than even the most dangerous of weapons. He didn't think he was a hero. He had simply done his job. Even under the most difficult conditions, he had fulfilled the requirements of his training and his oath. With these thoughts, he stepped out of the military base's door. He was no longer Guard Delacroix. He was Mark, one of millions, heading home in the cool Paris evening. After a few steps, he passed a small cafe. The people inside were gathered around a television screen, excitedly watching a video. On the screen were the famous images of a soldier neutralizing four aggressors. The people spoke of the soldier with awe and admiration. But none of them knew that the man in simple clothes with tired eyes passing by the window was the hero they were watching with such admiration. And for Mark, the greatest reward was precisely this, anonymity. He lived not for fame, but for honor. This story reminds us anew of the definition of true strength and heroism. Heroism is not in a show performed in front of cameras or in the applause one receives. True heroism is the ability to remain true to one's principles and values even when no one is watching, even in the most difficult moments. If this story made you think deeply, don't forget to like our video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Activate the notification bell so you don't miss our new stories. And remember, the greatest battles in a person's life are not against others, but the battles fought within, between one's ego and one's will. And a person who is victorious in that battle is like one who has conquered the entire world.